Well, good morning, church family. This is Pastor Lyle. Always hate when we can't be together for worship on days like this with the weather preventing us from being together. I hope you're doing well, praying for you and your families as you navigate the storm that we're in, and praying for everything to proceed quickly, for things to get back to normal real soon. And I know the temperatures don't look great in the week ahead, but praying for things to return to some sort of normalcy. But just thought that on this day when we are gathered virtually, always thankful for the ability to do this, even when we're not able to be together, to be able to gather in this format. And so today we're basically going to do a Bible study continuing where the sermon left off last week in the book of Nehemiah. Last week we started this new series called Rise and Rebuild, about God's vision for renewal. And I've been thinking a lot about that over the last few weeks, and thinking a lot about that even this week. And so as I was thinking about it, I was reading some things about hope and about church revitalization, and I came across a story of a young man who in the early 1970s was thinking about taking a church in an impoverished area of Brooklyn, New York. And he went and looked at the church, and he had several friends that advised him that he couldn't or shouldn't pastor that church. He walked in and the building was in disrepair. I mean, it was obvious. Things were peeling, paint was peeling. There were leaks in the ceilings. There was structure that was wrong. Carpet was worn thin. Literally, the church was falling apart. And as he looked through that, he began to ask some real questions about what he was going to be able to do with it, and if he could help in any way to revitalize this community. Like I said, more than one person had told him, "You don't want that church. It's dead. It's gone. It's too far." But he felt like the Lord was calling him to do something about it. He talks about standing in the midst of that worn-out sanctuary and said, "I just didn't see what it was. I saw what it could be." He had a vision of people filling the seats. He saw lives being transformed there. He saw a place where hope could rise in the midst of that neighborhood. And that church became Brooklyn Tabernacle. And that man was Jim Cymbala, who came and pastored that church. Today it's known around the world for its worship. It's known for its prayer meetings. He's written books about what God has done in the midst of that place. But before it was a thriving church, it was a burden in someone's heart. Nothing changed in that neighborhood until someone walked into that brokenness. Nothing changed in that church until someone walked into that brokenness and said, "This matters. This isn't finished. Something needs to be done." That's exactly where Nehemiah is when we pick up in chapter 2 of Nehemiah. Last week we talked about the fact that he heard about Jerusalem. He wasn't looking for a construction problem. He wasn't looking for something to take over his life. But he heard about the ruin. He heard about the walls being broken, about the gates being burned. And the city that was supposed to be the home for God's people and for God's presence was a symbol of shame instead of a symbol of strength. Unfortunately, most people had gotten used to it and said it was too far gone. But Nehemiah couldn't let go. And before he ever laid a brick, before he ever made a plan, before he ever stood before the king, he had a moment where he looked at the brokenness and said, "This is not what it's supposed to be." And in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8, we see how God takes a man from burden to prayer to bold action. Read Nehemiah chapter 2, starting in verse 1 with me. "During the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was set before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I'd never been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, 'Why do you look so sad when you aren't sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart.' I was overwhelmed with fear and replied to the king, 'May the king live forever. Why should I not be sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?' Then the king asked me, 'What is your request?' So I prayed to the God of the heavens and answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah and to the city where my ancestors are buried, so that I might rebuild it. The king, with the queen seated beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and will you return? So I gave him a definite time, and it pleased the king to send me. I also said to the king, if it pleases the king, let me have letters written to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates River, so they will grant me safe passage until I reach Judah. And let me have a letter written to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to rebuild the gates of the temple's fortress, the city wall, and the home where I will live. The king granted my request, for the gracious hand of my God was on me. I want us to look at a couple of things in this passage to remind us of what it looks like when God takes us from burden to action. This is the transition for Nehemiah from burden to action. And the first thing we see in this passage is that God-given burdens cannot stay hidden. God-given burdens cannot stay hidden. Look at this first part of the first verse with me. It says, during the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was set before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I'd never been sad in his presence. A couple of quick notes about this. When it talks about Nisan, that would have been probably around the end of March, the beginning of April. And if you count that back, if you remember last week in chapter 1, that it said that he had this report come in Chislev, and that's when it kind of broke him. If you take the time from Chislev to Nisan, what you have is a 4-month gap, 120 days of silence to everyone else, but Nehemiah unceasing in conversation with God. Seeking the Lord in prayer, seeking the Lord in fasting. Now, just a reminder, we were told at the end of chapter 1 that Nehemiah was the cupbearer, the personal advisor to the king. He wasn't clergy, he wasn't a prophet, he wasn't a pastor. He was a layperson in a foreign workplace who had heard this report and was trying to figure out how to solve an issue. Just to let you know, by the way, King Artaxerxes reigned from 465 to 424 BC, and he is the one that in Ezra chapter 4, we are told, he is the primary reason the construction stopped in Jerusalem, including the walls. He had put an edict out that no more rebuilding could happen. And so when Nehemiah comes to him and he's sad in his presence, what we have in the midst of this is Nehemiah's God-given burden is beginning to bubble to the surface. In fact, what's interesting, that word sad there can actually mean evil or bad. Literally, the king says, why do you look so evil? Or why do you look so bad? Nehemiah almost looks like something ominous is happening, like he knows something terrible is going to happen to the king. 4 months of not showing anything, and today the mask slips. Burdens from the Lord often incubate privately. They almost stir privately, but they erupt publicly when God's timing is right. Eventually, what is burdening our heart comes out. Artaxerxes notices what is happening. Now, we can say this may be because of the compassion of the king, or maybe he had a special fondness for Nehemiah. But the reality is when he says, why do you look so sad when you aren't sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. It says right after that, I was overwhelmed with fear. There's a question of why he was overwhelmed with fear, but it was said that Persian protocol was that it was a capital offense. It was punishable by death to be saddened in the presence of a king, especially if it saddened the king. Esther, in the book of Esther, approaches the court in peril of death. And so at this point, Nehemiah's sadness is threatening his life. Sometimes the burdens of the Lord are going to cost us things. They're going to create within us a fear of stepping forward. Following Jesus, one pastor says, will eventually bruise your resume. And yet, Nehemiah's burden comes forth. May the king live forever. Why should I not be sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Nehemiah basically says, he doesn't use the word Jerusalem. He doesn't have to. Nehemiah is known by Artaxerxes of who he is. We have this picture of Nehemiah weeping over the city, praying over the city, fasting over the city. And this God-given burden that he has been carrying for these months now, for this 120 days, for this multiple of days in his own heart, eventually comes to the surface and cannot be hidden anymore. And his countenance on the outside demonstrates the grief on the inside. When God gives you a burden, eventually it has to come forward. The king's question exposes the servant's heart. The burden is on the table. Now watch what God-shaped reflex happens in Nehemiah's life. Because what happens next is that Nehemiah fires off an arrow prayer. Now we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But what I want us to understand is that arrow prayers proceed from persistent prayers. Look at what it says here, right at this part. Then the king asked me, "What is your request?" So I prayed to the God of heavens. There's a narrative tension that happens there. The king's question is both an investigation and an interrogation. In Persian courts, wrong requests could be fatal. But Nehemiah was in the midst of God's timing. 4 months of persistent praying now converged in one moment. Psalm 69:13 says, "At an acceptable time, O God, in the abundance of your steadfast love, answer me." The word for prayed here means to put something in God's court. It means to take a quick action. People throughout history, pastors and authors and scholars have called these arrow prayers. And the reason they're called arrow prayers is because they go straight from our heart to God. They're instantaneous. They were referencing how an archer could take a bow immediately, pull back, aim, and shoot real quick. Opportunity rarely knocks with advance notice. It often barges in on us. And an arrow prayer is the strength to go right before, as things happen, as things that are just a quick, Lord, help me. Lord, give me the words. Lord, now. Lord. And he prays to the God of heaven, this theological weight. That phrase appears 6 times in the book of Nehemiah. It emphasizes God's universal sovereignty, contrasting it with a regional deity. And the way that he is able to do this arrow prayer is because he had been living a life of persistent prayer. Verses 4 through 11 in chapter 1 remind us that he was fasting, he was mourning, he was covenant confessing, he was specifically asking for favor in the sight of this man. Today's arrow prayer flies true because its bowstring was pulled by persistent prayer of 4 months. We see this combination of sovereignty and responsibility in one breath. God turns the heart. God gives the word. Nehemiah's whisper affirms only God can do what I'm about to ask. But Nehemiah still must speak. Nehemiah still must request. And so a prayed up servant offers a prayer to the Lord and then immediately opens his mouth in obedience. Because ultimately what we have to realize is that just like arrow prayers proceed from persistent prayers, that all leads up to something, and eventually real faith requires bold action. Look at what happens here. The king asked me, "What is your request?" So I prayed to the God of heavens and answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah and to the city where my ancestors are buried, so that I may rebuild it." Interesting fact about that particular word, "send" there. It's the same root that we find in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, when God sends Abraham from his country that he knows to a new country. And it's also the same word used in Isaiah 6:8, same root, when Isaiah says, "Here am I, send me." It implies being delegated authority to go. Nehemiah is asking specifically here to be the king's envoy back to Jerusalem, but even more than that, he's asking to be God's envoy, God's messenger, God's workman. Send me. The way that it's written, it is emphatic, not passive, suggesting a real commitment to do whatever is asked. So I prayed to the God of heavens and answered the king, "If it pleases me." One of the things that has to happen in our lives with a God-given burden is that we have to move from praying and praying and praying to eventually doing something about it. One of my favorite stories in the Bible, because it's just interesting to me how God works through a variety of ways, is the story of Moses. He's getting ready to cross over into the next section of the Promised Land. They're working through that, going on their journey. And the people are being stubborn. The people aren't wanting to go. And Moses stands before the Lord, and God has already told him to go. God has told him to take this bold action. Moses stands before the Lord, and he starts this prayer. It's this beautiful prayer. "Lord, may the people around me see today what you're doing." In the midst of it, God stops him and says, "Stop praying and get moving." Nehemiah reached the point at this moment. He realized it, and he took advantage of it. That this was God saying, quit praying and get moving. Faith is trusting the Lord with bold action. By faith, Abraham obeyed. By faith, Elijah. By faith, Elisha. By faith. Throughout the Old Testament, there is this recurring motif. Throughout the New Testament, this recurring motif that real faith requires bold action. William Carey is famous for saying, "Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God." He was a man that followed his own advice. He left a shoemaker's bench to travel around the world to take the gospel to those around. Are you, with the burden God's laid on your heart, asking God to merely fix something, or are you asking God to send you to fix it? Are you depending on someone else to fix the burden of your heart, or are you asking God to send you? Here's the reason faith is so important and bold action is so important, is because if it's truly a burden that God has given you, when you step out in faith, what we know from Nehemiah and from stories throughout Scripture is that God will provide. It's a great ending to this story. The king, with the queen seated beside him, we're not real sure why that's mentioned unless it was in a private audience that he was doing this, asked me, "How long will your journey take and when will you return?" So I gave him a definite time, and it pleased the king to send me. I also said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let me have letters written to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates River so that they will grant me safe passage until I reach Judah. And let me have a letter written to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so they will give me timber to rebuild the gates of the temple's fortress, the city wall, and the home where I live." The king granted my request, for the gracious hand of my God was on me. The king not only says yes, he asks follow-up logistics. How long are you going to be gone? When will you return? Indicates favor and trust. 3 specific requests Nehemiah had been praying about, thinking about, bringing before the Lord again and again and again. Letters to the governor saying he has passage, safe passage. Let him make it to where he is. Letters to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, asking for lumber for the temple gates, for city wall, for Nehemiah's own residence. Safe passage, timber, and the ability to rebuild. It says in here that the good hand of the Lord my God was on me. It's the favor of the Lord, beneficial for us. Nehemiah had numbers and names ready, a list of things that need to be taken place. That's because he'd been praying and thinking. He wasn't planning without prayer, he was planning through prayer. Planning without prayer is presumption. Praying without planning is just pious. But praying with planning allows us to be prepared to be used for God's glory. Hudson Taylor of China Inland Mission is famous for saying, God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. So here's my question. Do your requests of the Lord and the vision that he's given you, the burden he's laid on your heart, do they reveal a God-sized expectation of God providing, or you have a budget-sized faith? Are you asking the Lord to do above and beyond what we can ask or imagine? Are you asking bold prayers of the Lord, or are you asking on a budget? Are you asking with limitations? And whatever the Lord has burned in your heart as you're praying through that, what is God giving you that needs to take place in your life in order to step forward, in order to take action, in order to follow the Lord? What we see in this passage is a 4-step pattern. You have a burden in our hearts that comes, that God gives us, followed by a reflex of prayer because we've been praying again and again and again. And when the opportunity arises, we step out in faith, risking what we have for the glory of God, and God overflows in provision. The God who moves the heart with a burden, hears the heart with a prayer, he will embolden the heart in faith and supply the hand with provision. And so as we gather on this snow day, this ice day, this day when we aren't allowed to kind of be together, the question I have for you specifically is, what burden is God placing on your heart? Maybe about your family, maybe about your personal life, maybe about something bigger. In fact, my guess is God does want us to have a burden about our family. God does want us to have a burden about our personal lives. But he also wants us to have burdens about something bigger, because his kingdom is what we're called to be a part of. So what is God burdening you about in the kingdom? Secondly, are you willing to do whatever he asks, or have you been volunteering other people instead of yourself to accomplish it? Thirdly, what step of faith is he calling you to follow? And fourth, are you trusting him to provide? Thank you for joining us this morning on this Bible study, this online time when we gather to look at God's Word together. And I pray that you will continue to pray for our church, that you'll continue to pray for whatever God's vision may be for us as we look at rebuilding and redoing whatever God has called us to do. And I ask that you pray for us as we think through the burdens that God's laid on our hearts and the future of this great place that follows the Lord. Before we go, just a quick announcement, a reminder. With us not gathering this week, just a reminder that next week is our church-wide celebration. We're doing it Sunday, February 1st on the 3rd floor at 5 p.m. It may not be like we've had in the past. We're just going to go and do business in the midst of that. And so we'll talk about that more next week. But just remind you to be here next week, Sunday, February 1st. Let me say thank you again for joining us. Be praying for people in our church. Be praying for each other. Be praying for you in the midst of this. And I look forward to gathering together with you again in the very near future.